With the knowledge we gained about pages and routing and about data fetching, we already learned a lot about some of the core concepts and features offered by Next.js that make our life as a developer, and therefore also ultimately as a user of the website, better. But there are various optimizations and enhancements we can add to our pages. Certain aspects we didn't take a closer look at yet, and in this module we will. To be precise, we'll have a look at adding metadata and head data, so diving into those head tags and setting a title or setting some meta description for Google and so on. So we want to have a look at that and how we can do that with Next.js. We will then also explore how we can reuse certain components or logic or configuration across our Next.js app, so across our pages to be precise. And we will explore how we can optimize images and how we can ensure that images are served in the best possible way. Therefore, let's dive in. Now for this course section, I will actually use that little events project we worked on. So attached you find the latest snapshot of this. If you download it, you need to run npm install. And then once you did that, bring up the development server with npm run dev. This will give you this application here, and that's what we worked on over the last course sections. Now, the first aspect into which I want to dive here is the metadata, the head data we could add to every page. Because if we inspect our page here, and we have a look not at the body, but at the head section, which carries important metadata and information for the browser and for search engines, then we see that it's pretty empty. We got no description here. We have no title for this page. We got a bunch of imports, which are added automatically by Next.js for all our styles and so on. But we don't have that metadata, that extra data which we typically want to provide on our page. And of course, that is something which we definitely do want to have on the application we're building, because that enhances the user experience to a certain extent, depending on what we set there. For example, showing a title, which would show up in a tab up there. But it's also crucial for search engines, because search engine crawlers, like the Google crawler, will have a look at the title and the description set in that metadata. And therefore, it is something we want to set. And thankfully, Next.js makes setting such head data easy. If you want to add content between the head tags on your page, you can easily do that in Next.js applications with help of a special component. Let's say on our homepage, so this index.js file in the pages folder. There, let's say we want to add extra information to that head section. We can do that by importing a special component exposed by Next.js, the head component, which we import from next/head, like this. So where we imported link from next link, we now import head from next head. That's a special component which you can add anywhere in your JSX code for a given component. So here we don't have to add it at the top level. We can go into this div here and add the head component here. And please note, it's head written like this with a capital H. It's not head written like this. This would not have the effect we want. We need head written like this. Because now you can add your typical head section HTML elements between those special head tags, and Next.js will inject them into the head section of the page. So if I, for example, add a title here, which is a typical HTML element for the head section, we could set the title to Next.js events here, or whatever you want. And if you do so and save this, if you go back to the starting page, if I reload, You now see in the tab here, it shows our title. And if I inspect this page and I have a look at the head section there, we indeed see the title was added. So Next.js injects the content which we add between those head tags into the real head part of the rendered page. And of course, we're not restricted to the title. We can also add meta tags here, meta elements. These can also be self-closing since they have no content between the tags. And then, for example, add our description tag here with a content of find a lot of great events that allow you to evolve. Whatever, something like this. Maybe you find a better description. But we can add such a meta tag here. And now if we inspect the rendered page, we see that in the head, this now also is added. And that would be a special tag, this meta tag here with a name of description. That would be a tag which does matter to search engines, because in the end, this description text, which we added to the content attribute, that is the text that would show up in a search result when your page is showing up in Google search, for example. So that matters. And here, between these special head tags, so inside of this special head element, you can really add any HTML elements that would normally go into the head section of your page. And that allows you to fine-tune and configure what should show up in that head section. Now that we learned about this head element, we of course don't just want to set our own title and description for the starting page, but also for the other pages. And feel free to do this on your own, of course, with your titles and descriptions of your choice. I will start here with events in Next.js, and then here in the fragment, maybe here, add this head component, and of course therefore also import it. So import head from next head like this. And then here, since this lists all events, I will give it a title of all events. And I'll keep this description text. Of course, we could use a different one, but I'll keep that. Copy this again, go to the event ID page for a single event. And here I then also add this in my fragment and add the import head from next head like this. And with that, again, fine-tune this. And here, the title should actually be the title of the selected event. Now, the great thing is, since we use that in our regular page component JSX code, we can, of course, also inject dynamic content here. So instead of hard coding the title, we can use event.title here to use the title of the selected event. This is, of course, very important, because this ensures that we don't have to hard code all that head data in advance, but that since we add it to the regular component JSX code, that we can, of course, also use a lot of dynamic values. For the content, so for the description here, we could therefore, for example, also use event.description. So that is very, very useful. And with that, if I go to the slug, here I also want to add this. Add it down there. And therefore also import this from next. So import head from next head like this. And also set a title and a description here. So here I'll say filtered events. And then here we could, of course, again use a dynamic value for the description and kind of construct a dynamic text where we say all events for, and then I want to use the actual month and year that was selected. So I'll just output for num month / num year. And of course, you can fine-tune this text and format this state however you want. But with that, if we save all those different page files, if I go to all events, for example, and I search for events in May, we see that if I inspect the rendered page, in the head section, we have that title And we have that description with that content that contains the month and year. Now, it's also worth noting that we don't just see this head content in the actual rendered page, which we see here when we inspect it, but also in the response from the server. If we go back to the starting page, if we reload this page and we then view the page source, so that we now fetched a brand new page from the server, we also find the title in here and we also find the description in here. So that is really part of the response, which is important because that means that search engines will see it. Now you might notice though that if you filter for events, if we set a filter here and we find our events, here if we reload this page, in the page source we don't see the title and the description. And that's not a bug, but it has a simple reason. In our slug page here, we do add a head, but we only add it here in the main content, which we return if we make it past all these if checks we have in front of it. Now, if we make it into one of those if checks to show the loading text, or to show this error, or to show another error, then we didn't add head here. And of course we can add head here, and we probably would want to add head here to set specific different titles for these cases. But you also might want to set up some general head content, which is part of every page. And of course you can do that by including it in every page, but that involves a lot of copy and pasting. And therefore, let's now have a look at the different ways and tools Next.js gives us for reusing logic or reusing configuration like certain head elements across all pages without having to copy them around. So we learned about head. And typically you want to set up your head content in every page and also in every if branch inside of a page, because you have very specific titles and contents for those different scenarios. Now here in the slug page, for example, we definitely want to set our own title and our own description, but maybe we want to use the same title and description for all the different if cases then. So we want to reuse that and not copy it manually into all those different cases. We could copy it, but that's of course annoying. Now reusing here is simple. We don't need any special Next.js concept. We can use a standard React.js approach. Instead of copy and pasting it, we cut it from down there and we set it up once right at the beginning of this component render function. So here, before I have my first if check, so before we render something the first time, so to say, I create a new constant, page head data, or whatever you want to name it, and that contains my head section. Now, since I rely on num month and num year here, we might want to extract this first. So I'll cut that here and move this in front of this page head data part here. And then we can just include page head data in all our return statements. So for example here, I then wrap this into a fragment because I now want to add an adjacent JSX element. I want to also include my page head data and output the content of this constant dynamically in this returned JSX code. And the content of this constant, of course, is this JSX code. And we can now do this in all our return statements. So also here, and also in the final return statement here. So that would be a standard React way of reusing some logic. And if we do that, if I reload, I get an error that I cannot read property 0 of undefined. And the problem is that I'm accessing my filtered data here, and filtered data might be empty, of course, or it actually will be when the page renders the first time, because I explained that useRouter works such that it runs when the page was first rendered, and it doesn't have the path parameter values at this point. It then runs again and has access to them thereafter, but not at the beginning. And therefore, actually, I want to move that filtered data part after the if loaded events part. That was correct. And I want to set up my page head data thereafter, therefore. So below here. But I will remove const here and instead create page head data as a variable here and just assign a different content at the beginning. So here it still holds the head element, but I'll have a different description. So I'll copy the title and my meta content here, but the description here is a list of filtered events, something like this. So now we change the page head data inside of this component function, depending on whether we have data or not. And with that, if we save this and reload, this does load. And now if I inspect the page source here, we see that we do have that title and that we do have that description here. So that's how we can reuse the head data inside of a component if we have different return statements and therefore different pieces of JSX code that might be rendered by that component. But that's not the only way of reusage which we have. Besides reusing our head content inside of a component, we also might have certain head settings that should be the same across all page components. So we don't want to copy and paste it into every single page component. Now we could solve this by outsourcing it into a separate file, into a separate component, and then importing that into all the page components and using it there, but we can also use another approach. Next.js has this _app.js file, and it also has another file which we'll be able to utilize. Now let's understand what the idea behind those files is before we dive into them. The _app.js file is your root app component, which in the end is rendered for every page that is being displayed. This component here, which is received through props, this actually is the actual page component that should be rendered. My app, this component here, is rendered by Next.js, and this component prop will automatically be set by Next.js, so you don't need to do anything for that. But then you can utilize this _app.js file such that, as we're currently doing it, you wrap your page content with other components. Like here, I'm wrapping the layout component around the page component to give all pages the same layout, so the same navigation bar, for example. So that actually is a file which we are already utilizing. And of course, therefore, we could also import head here from next head, import it into this app.js file, and then add head here to set some generic setting that applies to all our page components. For example, we could add another meta tag here with a name of viewport and then a content of, let's say, initial-scale equals 1.0, comma, width equals device width. This would be a meta tag which is often added to pages to ensure that the page is responsive and scales correctly. And we therefore typically want to add this to all our pages, not just to some. So that would be a great example for some head tag, some head element, which you want to add to all pages, but which you of course don't want to copy around manually. Therefore, we can add it once in this app.js file, and if we do so, we see that if I reload this events page, for example, and I inspect my rendered page, then here this viewport name is part of this page. So that works. Now this is applied to all the pages by setting it up once in this _app.js file. Now in the last lecture we added head to the _app.js file. There is an important implication of this. Now we have the head element there in app.js, and we of course still also have it in our page components. In index.js in the events folder, for example, I also have head. And as you see on the rendered page, both is applied. The title and description from the page component, and the viewport from the _app.js file. And this is important. Next.js automatically merges multiple head elements. So if you set a head here in _app.js, and then also in the page component, the content of those different head sections gets merged. Even if we would have multiple head sections here inside of a single component, the content would be merged by Next.js. But of course, that means that we could also have conflicts. For example, I could have another title set here for whatever reasons, and now I set a title here and here. Now Next.js automatically merges your head sections, and it also resolves such conflicts. If I add multiple titles here, and I reload this events page, you see only one title shows up here, not multiple titles. It simply takes the latest element if you have the same element multiple times. So if we have the title here and here, the second title wins. The same would be true for meta elements with a name attribute. If you have other head content, which is neither a title nor a meta element with the name attribute, but let's say a meta element with some other attributes, then you can always add a manual key here, like description, to still allow Next.js to find out if two elements are clashing. And then again, the latter one will win. Now, of course, this is redundant code here, this extra head. I just wanted to show this Next.js behavior. And it does have an important implication, because it means that in _app.js, we can indeed also go into the head section we set up there and define a general title that applies to all pages unless it's overwritten. This ensures that we always have a title on every page, even if we forget to set a page-specific one, which we of course typically want to do. So here I'll then give all my pages a general title and also a general description. Again, that will be overwritten by the page-specific data, but in case we don't have page-specific data, then this general data would kick in. So here I have my general head set up, but if I reload this all events page, we don't see that there, because we do have page-specific data here, and that then overrides the more general data. Because the page component is rendered after the app component, so the later head section wins, and that will be the head section inside of the page component. Now, the _app.js file is not the only special Next.js file which allows us to set application-wide settings. There also is the _document.js file, which we can add. Just like _app.js, _document.js has to be added in the pages folder, directly in the pages folder. Not in some subfolder, but in the root level of the pages folder. It's not there by default, but if you add it, Next.js will take it into account and will use it. But what does document.js do? App.js is your application shell. You can imagine app.js as the root component inside of the body section of your HTML document. Document.js allows you to customize the entire HTML document, so all the elements that make up an HTML document. If you need to do that, you can add the _document.js file, and then you need to add a special component in there. A class-based component, as it turns out, which you could name my document. And it has to be a class-based component because it must extend some component offered and provided by Next.js. For this, we need to add an import of document from next/document. So we need to extend document here, and therefore we need to use a class-based component. And then in this class-based component, we need to add a render method, like we do in class-based React components. And then here we return some JSX code. That also should be special JSX code with a very specific structure. For this, we need to import more components from next document, And those components are the HTML component, the head component, the main component, and the next script component. Very important, the head component, which we are importing here, is not the same head component as we import from NextHead. These are different components. Head from NextHead is imported to use it anywhere in your JSX code to adjust the head content of the rendered page. Head imported from Next document should only be used in this special document component which we are building here. Now with those components imported in the rendered JSX content here, we should return a JSX structure where we have the HTML element as a wrapper, then we have the head element like this, and then we have a body HTML element, so no special component but the standard body element, and inside of that main and next script like this. That is the default structure which you should add, and that's the default structure which the default document has if you don't override it. So if you override it, you want to recreate that structure. And you should also, of course, export the document as the default. Now, what could be reasons for overriding that default document? Well, if you want to configure the general document. For example, if you want to add the lang attribute on HTML and set this to en. If we don't do this and save everything and we reload, we see that there is no lang attribute on the rendered HTML element. If we do that, if we add lang and set this to en, or to whichever language applies to your page, then if we restart the dev server, which we need to do here once, if we reload the page thereafter, we see the lang attribute. So I needed to restart the server here for this to have an effect, but then we see that this is taken into account. We could also add other elements here to the body, like for example a div with an ID of overlays, like that. If we do that and save this, and we reload, we see in the body there is this div. Why might we want to do that? Well, this allows us to add HTML content outside of our application component tree. For example, for using those elements with React portals then. We could select this div with a React portal to portal our modals or overlays to this element. So having extra HTML elements which are outside of our application component tree can sometimes be useful. Because your Next.js application is in the end rendered by this main component, which you therefore must include, but adding extra elements can sometimes also be beneficial. And therefore, if you need to edit the overall HTML document, you can do this by adding such an underscore document.js file. So by now, we optimized our meta tags in the head section. But there's another important aspect of basically any website you're building that also should be optimized: our images. We are rendering a couple of images here when we render that list of events, and also when we explore a single event. Here we also have an image, and in both cases, those images are not optimized at all. Let me show you what that means. On the All Events page, if I open the developer tools and we go to the network tab here, if we then empty the cache and hard reload by right-clicking on the refresh icon, we make sure that we reload all the data for this page, including the images. And now let's have a look at this coding event JPEG file. If I make this a bit bigger, we see that this image has 2 megabytes. The introvert and extrovert images are even worse. They have 5 and 4 megabytes. The reason for this is that these are huge, unoptimized images which are fetched in full size and quality. And we are also always using the same image type, JPEG, no matter if our browser maybe supports a better type. For example, Chrome would support the WebP image type, which is an optimized image format. Now for development, that's no problem. But this would not be okay for production. These would be way too big images. And Next.js calls itself the React framework for production. And shipping such big images is certainly not production ready. Therefore, it makes a lot of sense that Next.js also helps us with images. It helps us optimize those images, and it does so in a super simple way. Optimizing images with Next.js is easy. Here I'm in the event item component, which is that component that renders the image in that list of event items. Now currently we're using the standard image tag, the standard image element, but for optimizing images, we can import a component offered by Next.js, the image component, from next/image. Now this is a special component which we can use to replace the standard image element. And when we use that special component, Next.js will create multiple versions of our image on the fly when requests are coming in, optimized for the operating systems and device sizes that are making the request. And then those generated images will be cached for future requests from similar devices. So to enable this, we need to use this image component here instead of our own image component, and we can copy over source and alt. That also works on that next image component. But now we also need to add two more attributes, two more props here. And that's the width and the height attributes. We need to set those to basically inform Next.js about the width and height of this image. And with that, I don't mean the original width and height of the image, but the width and height which we need for the image here. For determining the width and height, we should keep in mind that our image is displayed in two possible ways. It either takes the full width of the container on smaller screens, or just a fraction of the width on bigger screen sizes, because then we have the image on the left side and the other content on the right side. Now in the CSS code we can see this here basically. I'm using flexbox on the parent container, and on smaller screens that is a column flexbox, so items are rendered on top of each other. But on bigger screens, the items sit next to each other, and then the image has 40% of the width of the overall item. Now the overall item width is determined by the event list styles, and there we have a max width of 40 rem. So overall we have around 640 pixels, that is what 40 rem are in pixels, as a width for the overall item. And the image has around 40% of that. Hence here we could try setting width to around 340 pixels maybe, which are roughly 40% of 640. And set the height to, here we have 10 rem for the image, so that are 160 pixels, so that's the value I will use here. So with that I'm determining the width and height of the image as it should be loaded on the screen. I'm not setting width and height of the original files. As you see, these files here have much bigger dimensions. I'm not using those. So with that, if we save this and we reload, we see our image showing up here. Now it's a little bit too wide, so I'll actually shrink this to 250 here, and that looks better. And on a smaller screen, that also works. And the nice thing here now is that if we now open the developer tools again, and we again empty the cache and hard reload, we will see that these images are much smaller. We see that here, this image is now only 19 kilobytes instead of the megabytes we had before. So all these images are much smaller. They are also fetched as a different type now, as WebP here, since I'm using Chrome and Chrome supports this optimized image format. And they also have reduced quality to shrink the file size even more without impacting the image. The quality is only reduced such that we don't really see it. Now that's working because Next.js, as I explained, generates optimized images on the fly. Now we can see those generated images in the .next folder. There in the cache folder, we have an images folder, and in there we have a couple of cryptic files which in the end contain the images as they are generated by Next.js. And these are the optimized images which are generated when they're needed. So they're not generated in advance, but when a request reaches the page. But then they are stored so that future requests from similar devices immediately get that already generated image. And that's therefore another very nice feature Next.js has built in. Now, besides the size optimizations, which are of course super important, those images also have another nice benefit. Or the image component offered by Next.js has another nice benefit. If we're on a smaller screen here, and I then reload, if I clear my network tab, watch what happens if I increase the screen size. As it increases, you see a new request is made for that bottommost image. That request is being made because by default, images are lazy loaded, which means if they're not visible, Next.js will not download them. And that's another difference to the built-in image component. There, all images were loaded eagerly, which means they were loaded all the time. Now they are only loaded when they're needed, and that further decreases the amount of requests we're making in advance and the bandwidth we're taking up with our page. So that's another nice feature. We don't load what we don't need. So Next Image is a super important component. It allows us to ship production-ready images, and therefore I also want to use it on the event detail page. There in event logistics, I'm also displaying an image, and I now also want to use the Next Image component there. So we import image from Next Image here as well, and replace this image, the default image, with the Next Image. Again, copying source and alt, and then we need to figure out the width and the height. So for this, let's briefly again have a look at the CSS code here. And we see for the image, I'm using a width and height of 10 rem each. So that would be 160 pixels. Hence, that is what I want to load here. 160, 160. And with that said, if we now go back to the page and we visit an individual image, we see that also is being loaded. Now it's looking a bit blurry, so maybe here we should actually use a bigger width and height, maybe 240 instead of 160. And if we do that, it looks sharper. Maybe we ramped it up even more. So finding the right width and height here also will be a bit of trial and error. You still override width and height as you set it here with your CSS styles. So if you give the image a hard-coded width and height, those CSS styles still kick in. The width and height you set here only determine the image size that will be fetched in the end. The final styling is still being done with CSS. And here it's simply looking a bit blurry because I was zoomed in. If I wasn't zoomed in, 160 pixels would have worked out. But I also want it to look good when I do zoom in, so I will pick slightly bigger values here, maybe 400. Again, only because I'm being zoomed in here. Yeah, I think that looks all right. So now with that, we're using the image component on this page as well. And in general, in your Next applications, you want to use the Next image component instead of the standard image component, since that Next image component gives you a lot of optimizations out of the box, and it is super easy to use. Now for our purposes, we are using the Next image component exactly as we want. But I also want to point you at the official Next image documentation. Because besides the way we are using the image, which is a very common way and a great way, there are a lot of props which you can configure to fine-tune how the image is loaded. You can change how it's being resized on smaller or bigger screens, or if it's resized at all, how it's being loaded. You can make it work with cloud image providers and much more. You can also fine-tune the quality decrease which is being used, for example. So definitely have a look at those docs at all to make sure that you are loading images in exactly the way you need to load them for your applications. Now with that, that's it for this module. We optimized images. We ensured that we don't load those super huge images therefore. And we also optimized our metadata, our page metadata. With the head component offered by Next.js, which we can include in our pages to set the title, meta description, or any other head section tags from inside our page components. We also learned about _app and _document.js, which are files that allow us to set up certain settings and elements which are being used across all pages in our application. With that, we can set up general metadata, or for example, inject extra HTML content into the loaded HTML document. And with that, we got a couple of important tools which we will need to build real applications with Next.js. Because of course, on real applications, you want to have metadata in the head section, and you want to have optimized images. And now you know how to do both in your Next apps.